that China is powerful and insecure.
As the feature of rampant misconceptions.
India and China cannot go to war.
That informal summits has its own limitations.
Today my guest is Dr. Shrikant Kondapalli. Dr. Kondapalli needs no introduction. He is one of India's most distinguished scholar on India-China relations. Dr. Kondapalli is a professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University. He is closely associated with Indian and Chinese think tanks. His research on geoeconomics and geopolitics of Asia is well lauded. He is a prolific writer. He has authored a number of books and hundreds of articles on India-China relations. Welcome to the dialogue, Dr. Kondapalli. Let me start with a very basic question on India-China relationship. India and China are not only neighbors and older civilizations, but have a centuries-old relationship and exchanges between them through religion, through culture, through businesses. Actually, the exchanges between India and China have increased multifold post-2000, more so after 2014 when Mr. Modi came to the power. But somehow you do not feel that confidence about India-China relationship. There has always been ups and downs. There has always been an element of misperception and lack of trust in India-China relationship. Why is it so?
Thank you very much for having me on the show, Mr. Saqib. It's a good question. Historically, China and India have been living for such a long 2,000 odd years of civilizations. The Chinese have a concept called Tianzhu, which basically means Western heaven. So if you shake any child in China, they mention about the Monkey King who had gone from China to India, Indian subcontinent in historical times. And he picked up a lot of magical traits and defeats the evil. So the journey to the West is a major epic in China. And so there is a lot of soft corner for India among the Chinese, number one. Number two, because of the Buddhism that has spread from India to Tibet, to China, to Japan, to other East Asian countries. Today, there are roughly about 18 to 20% Chinese believing in Buddhism. And we are mentioning here 1.47 billion and 18 to 20% of that population. So quite a huge number. Although the Buddhist monasteries are governed by what is mentioned as patriotic associations, nevertheless, the positive side is that they have a lot of reverence for India because Buddha was born, attained enlightenment at Bodh Gaya. And so there is a lot of positive kind of image. So these two, journey to the West and Buddhism, have created that huge stock of positiveness from China to India. In the recent times, we also have a lot of issues. For instance, India and China in their joint statements mention that they are the two largest countries which are developing. So they have a lot of coordination, for example, in the World Trade Organization or on climate change issues in the basic format, Brazil, South Africa, India, China format, or on other multilateral institutions. So this stems from the joint statements that they are largest developing countries. So this is a third major asset, a positive thing. Fourth is obviously China is the second largest economy. India is the sixth largest economy in the world. And so they have a lot of coordination at various areas. Then they also have consumption of resources. Because of their industrialization or economic activity, they keep importing a lot of resources from abroad, especially from South America, from Asia, Africa, and others. They also are very young. China is 36 years old on an average, while India is 26 years old in terms of the demographic profile. And so there is a huge dividend for them in this process. Yet, of course, what has happened is that despite the engagement policies that the Nehru government adopted in the 1950s, and that include India's acceptance of One China policy on Tibet, on Taiwan, on People's Republic of China's membership in the United Nations. The campaign since 1950s, India had supported. There is also the cooperation in multilateral fields, in Bandung Conference, in Afro-Asian unity, in various multilateral institutions today. There is the border trade and commerce, which is of course minuscule but is important. Then there is also the cultural exchanges, which would have built up trust among the two countries. Then the diplomatic engagement policies. We have had ambassadorial level exchanges. We now expanded into different consulates at Mumbai, at Kolkata, and so on, in China at Shanghai and Guangzhou. And there is a proposal for Chengdu and Chennai to be opened as consulates. So there has been expansion in the diplomatic engagement as well. We do have a problem, major problem. Since 1947 or 1949, in the case of China, we have not resolved the territorial dispute between the two sides. And so this creates some kind of an uncertainty and also some kind of mistrust. A lot of mistrust is actually flown from the unresolved territorial dispute between India and China. Either we call it in 1962 or in the recent times, absence of a dispute resolution has created so much stock of suspicion among each other. Westphalia Treaty in 1648 created some semblance of unity among the European powers. And since then, that has become a major source of trust between the European partners. And with the Franco-German agreement on steel and other, they have customs union, and then they just opened up the entire borders. Borders became irrelevant for them once the economic activity kicked in. So essentially, India and China did not resolve, but wanted to expand relations in other fields. So I think this is one of the areas of mutual suspicion that is growing between the two. So it is called the spiral of tensions. One side increasing defense budget or military logistics or road construction or deployment of military troops is seen by the other in negative terms. So that results in a lot of suspicion and increase in mutual mistrust. Secondly, we try to resolve this by confidence building measures since 1978 in Chushul sector, but most prominently with Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao visit in 1993. We ruled out war as an instrument for resolving the territorial dispute. And subsequently in 1996, President Jiang Zemin visited India, and we have specific CBMs in the military field. These have further been expanded. One of the crucial things about the CBMs, it actually built up trust because we prevented conflict till June 15th night last year. So as a result, we have also built up a stock of trust in reality between 1993 till 2020. We could still build on that stock. There was a proposal, for example, in the Xiamen meeting of the BRICS in September 2017 after the Doklam crisis, where we tried to initiate new CBMs. Of course, between 2017 to 2021, that project could not be initiated or flowered. As a result, we see this mutual mistrust increasing. So two sources, essentially one on the territorial dispute, secondly on the CBMs, which are not complete. We actually had CBMs are 50-50, one in terms of conflict prevention, which we did till June 15th night last year. Secondly, we should have graduated further with new CBMs, but we could not do for various reasons. In the meanwhile, other aspects also created suspicion. For example, China-Pakistan relations or India-US relations, what they call as the third party role has created misperceptions. So at the moment we have these. So this is very unfortunate because these two have lived together historically and now have reached the nadir of bilateral relations since last year. I am hopeful that they will resolve this issue sooner than later.
As you mentioned that border is a contentious issue. But the border issue was always there. There were skirmishes and verbal duels between both the armies at the border. But somehow it was manageable. It did not really reach there when we have a serious conflict between two forces. And not a single bullet was fired for decades. But somehow, now these skirmishes or conflict is increasing. The frequency and intensity is increasing on a regular basis. So what is it? What has changed now? The thing you mentioned was the third party role. So is it really, the border remains the main issue, or all these two things, the third party role and the new leadership is playing much more important role? And the other issues which are not related to boundary, but to resolve those issues, we come to the boundary and it is converting into boundary conflicts. What do you think?
Indeed, I think there is also the new leadership that has come about in both India and China. For example, many analysts have mentioned about the rise of nationalism in China as well as in India. President Xi Jinping is seen as the most powerful leader after Mao Zedong. And he today combines a number of posts unprecedented in nature since 1976, passing away of Mao Zedong. He combines some 13 to 14 posts, big posts like President, the General Secretary, the CMC Chairman, Central Military Commission Chairman, Chairman of the Comprehensively Deepening Reforms. He is the Commander of the Army, a new position that has been created. He is also Chairman of the Emergency Relief Aspects, which means anything that is prominent issue for China that needs to be addressed by President Xi Jinping. Likewise, some other. So much so, today he has highly centralized power in China, which is to an extent positive in resolving territorial disputes or others, because he can take a decision. Unlike the previous leaders who may have to fall back on party committees or on other Politburo standing committee members, this is to an extent positive because the decision could be decisive. An option he can choose and then it could be a decisive. In the case of India, we have also since 2014, for the first time, coalition governments have gone away and we have a simple majority enjoyed by the NDA. And also we have highly nationalist political trend that has commenced at that time. And in the recent elections in 2019, the majority has increased for the NDA partners. So we do see there is the rise of nationalism and the rise of more decisive leaderships in China and India. So this could also be possibly an explanation on why we see changes that we saw in the last 1 year. For example, the 19-party Congress in the work report of the General Secretary mentions about occupying the center stage in global and regional orders. And so China wants to be occupying that central place. In India as well, there is a debate about leading position. For example, Dr. Jaishankar, in a speech in Singapore, mentioned about India occupying the leading position. So these could also be considered as clashing points. While they experimented with the two informal summit meetings at Wuhan and in Chennai, yet the resolution of disputes has not taken place. So the first proposition that these leaders are decisive so they can take decisive action has not materialized in terms of resolving the disputes. For instance, the territorial dispute or other differences that they have that could have been resolved.
You said that Mr. Xi and Mr. Modi, they are very strong and popular leader. They have decision powers rested in them. They have developed a kind of a chemistry with each other after meeting so many times. Wuhan and Mahabalipuram was a very important event for them to reach some decisions. But somehow nothing came out of these two meetings. Although they know that India and China's future rest with each other. We need each other. But nothing concrete has come out of these formal and informal meetings. What is the reason? What do you think?
I think 2-3 issues. One is the territorial dispute. Again, there is the two rising powers. They have to meet somewhere. They did meet in Wuhan and Chennai, but that did not resolve the problem. They also experimented with the military in terms of meeting somewhere, and they met at Galwan. And of course, we saw the 20 Indian soldiers and 4 Chinese soldiers killed in this unfortunate event. Of course, since both are rising countries, both are big countries with huge population, and in military terms, both have strategic depth, both are conventionally and strategically well strengthened. So there is also a limitation for this kind of an approach between India and China, a military approach. In my opinion, China and India cannot openly fight with each other. And that would be unless until you have very highly irrational leaderships, unless until you have a cataclysmic development. I do not think India and China will fight with each other with big arms, big militaries. So it would be a localized, like we saw in Galwan, with a limited number of casualties and military engagement. So that also explains to the limitation, because they fundamentally, both China and India's focus is on development. So as a result, the leaderships will hold back all the time, because unless until you create per capita income to the citizens, a decent per capita income to the citizens, there is no way the leaderships could explain to their own people about the legitimacy of going to war with each other. So there is actually a structural limitation in India-China relations, which is they can never go to war. War meaning a big war. A small kind of skirmish like Galwan, we did not even think about this, but it did happen. It is a possibility. And of course, since June 15th night, we have not seen any clashes, not even pushing and shoving, not even stowing thrones. So June 15th also has brought in a kind of deterrence between the two sides. So I think that is the peak of military experimentation by the two leaders, a political experimentation in Wuhan and Chennai, and a military experimentation in Galwan. And that showed the limitations of use of force by the two sides.
Another issue which is discussed on constraint of India-China relationship is that India and China do not support each other in international forums or international relations. Such as that in China does not support India on NSG or UNSC membership. Similarly, China feels that India plays very active role when there is an initiative which is taken by the West to contain China, such as South China Sea, making this new initiative like Quad. What does this containment means, and why will India play an active role in it?
It's a good question. There is a huge literature available on this issue. There is obviously Chinese concerns on whether India is joining the bandwagon of the US. I think for two main reasons, containment of China is not a project that India is looking at. China may claim that, oh my God, the Indians are clubbing up with the US to contain China. I have these reasons. And Dr. Manmohan Singh, the former prime minister, told President Hu Jintao that we are not part of the containment of China. Of course, the Chinese have not given any reciprocal gesture by saying China will not be part of containment of India. What is important is in this conversation between Dr. Manmohan Singh and Hu Jintao, we did see an Indian assurance on not containing China. Number two, Prime Minister Modi, in the Shangri-La dialogue some 3 years ago, he mentioned that India is not part of the containment of China. So these two explicit statements from the prime ministers from two different political spectrums should assure China it is not part of the containment of China. But I will give the other two reasons why India cannot be part of the containment of China. One is a political and ideological reason. Since the 1950s, as India had supported the non-alignment movement, India had opposed the concept of containment of China, of any country, including the then Soviet Union or China. In fact, Nehru's engagement policies were to defy that kind of a containment when the Americans had trade embargoes in 1950s against China, about the People's Republic of China at the time. So there is the ideological political element where we see India is kind of wedded to this idea of not containing China. Of course, one can argue that the non-alignment has taken a relatively backseat in India's foreign policy. Nevertheless, it is some kind of a influencer in the foreign policy. I do not think this aspect has been jettisoned by the South Bloc even today. So political and ideological factor is number one, which is important to understand why India will not be part of the containment of China. Number two is a very practical problem. Containment of US of the Soviet Union in the 1950s had three elements. Number one is the nuclear dimension. So US tried to contain the USSR through nuclear deterrence. However, in the India-China parlance in the nuclear field, India never used the word deterrence against China. India's word to explain China is dissuasion, that is through CBMs or other aspects. So trying to dissuade China on the nuclear issue. So when Galwan happened, nobody spoke about the nuclear issue, although that is a weapon that both have, China in 1964 and India in 1998. So the Soviet Union-US containment aspect, which is nuclear primarily, that is absent between India and China. Number one. Number two, there is also the conventional mobilization. The Americans had mobilized all their aircraft carriers against the then Soviet Union and China and North Korea and Cuba and other communist countries. Except in the last 1 year, we have not seen actually any conventional mobilization between the two sides. At the moment, of course, China had mobilized 60,000 troops on India, while India mobilized about 90,000 troops on China in the Western sector. But this is not an all-round mobilization across the line of actual control. That is because if you have to have a full-fledged containment of China, India's defense budget should increase from 50 billion to probably $1 trillion. India's GDP is just about $2.2 trillion, and it cannot raise the defense budget to nearly 1 trillion. So containment practically means that you need to invest a lot in the defense sector, which is not possible in India because of the social sector, poverty, education, healthcare, or other related aspects. So practically, India will not be able to contain China because its defense budget is pretty low, $52 billion. So it is simply practically not possible for India to contain China on this count.
The one is military and strategic containment. The other is economic containment. You know, when COVID happened, all countries were worried about their industrial sector, especially small and medium enterprises. They thought that they have become weak and vulnerable and they can be taken over by foreign companies. Maybe they had China in mind, but they never mentioned it. India was the only one which was more than obvious by declaring a policy that foreign investment from bordering areas will not be allowed. They banned number of Chinese applications. They also, made changes in foreign direct investment policy for China. They also refused to join RCEP, maybe because the China was there and they did not want to compete with it. They also did not join BRI. So it looks like that any initiative, economic initiative, which was taken by China or China playing a role there, India was reluctant to be part of it. So it looked like that India is towing the line of the Western countries or being part of US and China trade conflict.
Yes, there is. I forgot to mention about the economic aspect of containment. So US and Soviet Union, they hardly had any trade. They hardly had any people-to-people interaction. They hardly had any investment, no investment, because the US Congress passed the Enemy Act in 1919 and then extended this in 1950s. So as a result, the economic aspect is also part of the containment. However, in the case of India-China, the crucial thing is prior to COVID-19, we did see that we had about 360 people from India going to China or vice versa, compared to over 6,000 people between US and China every day. We had about 360 odd people. So this is not really very high, yet we did not stop this tourism flow between the two sides. Of course, they had concerns on the spicy food, the lack of infrastructure in India, or on other counts. Yet we had some 2 to 3 lakh Indians going to China every year as tourists, no restrictions at all on them. So it was not a part of the containment in economic field. Number two, in relation to the investments and the app ban on Confucius classrooms, that happened in the background of the Galwan incident. And so I think it is closely linked to the Galwan incident rather than on actually containment policies. So it is limited in nature because trade is still booming. Trade actually saw some increase despite the supply chain disruptions last year. We had nearly almost the same levels of trade. So there is no major impact. In fact, the Indian exports have increased some 20% odd last year. So there is no containment in terms of trade. Also in terms of the other aspects, like for instance, the AIIB, India is the second largest partner in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank with some 8.24% voting shares. And so, as you know, the AIIB is part of the BRI construction or other infrastructure in Asia construction funding. And incidentally, India is one of the major beneficiaries of the AIIB with several billions of dollars of investments in India. Secondly, the other BCIM, India has not objected to the BCIM. In fact, we have had 3 high-level meetings on that count. It is slow, partly because of the insurgency in Northeast. It is slow, partly because of broader issues on the financial crisis and COVID-19 disruptions. But India did not object to the BCIM EC, Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar Economic Corridor. So on the BRI, it is not a part of containment by India, but I think it is part of the larger leadership issue. China floated the Belt and Road Initiative as a kind of China coming out party, and it has now trying to unite Europe, Asia, and Africa, and possibly in future South America, because they have investments in Brazil, Mexico, and other countries, Argentina. So it is likely that China's, at the end of the tunnel, the BRI is to resurrect China's leadership in these continents. So I think India was holding back because equally with 1.2 billion people and equally with estimates of India becoming the 3rd largest economy, there may be a thinking, and this thinking is from Lord Clive in British India to Nehru, when we look at Discovery of India passages, that India will never become second fiddle to any other country, as Nehru mentioned. So this thought process is there in the Indian leadership broadly, which is that any grand strategy, any grand idea, we will take some time to examine. We will accept some issues like AIIB, BCIM, but on the larger leadership issue, we want to be examining this, analyzing this. We would prefer a concert of Asian powers like China, Japan, Indonesia, Turkey, India, Kazakhstan, or others, Vietnam. So India is looking for a concert of Asian powers rather than one power dominating the whole strategic landscape. So we do not know what is at the end of the BRI tunnel, whether it wants to place China at the high pedestal at the cost of other countries. So that is the key problem for Indian leadership, which is trying to examine the BRI end product.
You just said that India prefers a concert of Asian powers initiative. What does it mean? Does it mean that any initiative has to be taken by multiple countries together? A single country cannot take an initiative? Or for example, the BRI or Belt and Road Initiative, maybe it was unilaterally started by China, but it started on strength in a sense that China is very good in infrastructure, they are very good in manufacturing, and they probably want to spread that strength to other countries and all. Everybody can join it. You can have your issues on it. For example, in the case of BRI, you can talk about debt issues, you can talk about environmental issues, you can talk about the domestic issue, geopolitical issues like CPEC is there and all those things. So the BRI may be a unilateral initiative by China, but almost all countries in Asia have joined it. So doesn't it make it a concert of Asian powers? And how does it work that it has to be a joint initiative by all Asian countries together?
I think the specific strengths that every country has. For example, the India, Indonesia, and Japan have floated the AAGC, Asia Africa Growth Corridor. Of course, it has not grown as spectacularly as the BRI, but nevertheless, that's an idea. Secondly, India joined the Iranian and Russian initiative on the North-South Transport Corridor, which also has not picked up as the BRI did. Nevertheless, that's an idea they have. Thirdly, there is the Indian Ocean initiatives that India has with the Indian Ocean, the maritime states. That is again an idea. And all these depend on, of course, all these countries pulling up in GDP and other parameters. My hope is that they are on the right path, trying to put together their strengths and overcome some of the weaknesses. So when Nehru invited Chou En-lai to the Bandung conference in 1955, he was trying to convey a message that while China was a pariah state, no one recognized China except the Soviet republics. Of course, Pakistan, India, Burma have recognized China at the time. So Nehru's idea was, let us bring China into the limelight. Let us engage China with all the other Afro-Asian countries. It is better to have China in this group rather than left as a pariah, because that would have become much more problematic for everybody. So I think that idea continues in a way that let us experiment with all kinds of ideas that we have at the moment, put all eggs in different baskets, like the AAGC, like the North-South Transport Corridor, like the Indian Ocean, not just one basket that is the BRI, but in other baskets as well. So that is, I think, an idea broadly what India is looking at.
You mentioned other initiatives such as North-South Corridor, Africa Corridor, Indian Ocean initiatives and all. Can't BRI be also treated like another initiative? Maybe it is started by China, but all countries together and work together in each other's initiative and make it success.
That's precisely the Prime Minister Modi's statement in Shangri-La. That is, the architecture that we want to develop is going to be inclusive, but with the condition that ASEAN centrality should be there. Because these are, since 1960s, they have, experimenting with multilateralism and relatively successful compared to the other multilateral groupings. So two conditions. One is it should be inclusive. So China can join any of these architectures in principle. If China does not want to join, that's a different issue. But there is a welcome move in terms of the inclusiveness. The only condition is ASEAN centrality. Of course, India is not the leader of ASEAN, yet India is also trying to say, let us have the ASEAN centrality. So I think there is the inclusiveness that India is trying to project, including for many. As I mentioned, India is also part of the BRI in many senses. It is only with the CPEC that it has a major problem. Other issues like debt diplomacy, environmental issues, transparency, or others are minor. But the major one is the CPEC projects. And I think China should have considered, because China itself is very sensitive when it comes to sovereignty issues on Tibet, Taiwan, or on other issues. So I think they should have been much more considerate to India in addressing the sovereignty aspects.
Yes, CPEC is a serious issue for India for obvious reasons. But BRI is a large project with international dimensions. And I think that India can benefit a lot by being part of it. Same is true for China also. For China, for BRI to be successful, I think India has to be part of BRI. So is there a way that we can somehow circumvent CPEC and be part of BRI?
I think that is quite possible. For instance, Japan had joined the BRI with the Chinese promises of multi-billion dollar construction projects in the infrastructure areas. So there was a proposal from China to the LDP, Liberal Democratic Party. And so there is also the Japanese move in this direction. I think if the signaling from China is right, I think if we have some kind of a dialogue process on the BRI, of course, India's position on CPEC, China needs to address, for instance, not going through Gilgit-Baltistan and POK areas. That is the only, India's problem is not with the entire CPEC. If they are doing something in Gwadar, if they are doing something in Karachi, that's not India's concern. India's concern is basically in the Kashmir region because the instrument of accession in 1947 suggests to Kashmir as part of India. Everything flew from that. And so the concern is only in relation to this area. So if there is China did mention that these are all commercial projects, that it is not related to sovereignty, etc. However, when they deployed some 36,000 security guards, India's concerns have increased. For instance, the Indian Army chief mentioned about this figure. And so this became not just commercial, but also semi-security related. So if there is an assurance from China in this regard, it is quite possible that the Chinese and Indians can bring in their own strengths. Indian strength is also in the port construction, like in Chabahar, like in Sabang, like in other areas. India has been constructing these ports. So there is a certain unique selling point that India has in this domain. Second is in terms of the software. As you mentioned, IT professionals, there is also English language comprehension or on other counts. It's actually, if China and India sit together and they work out the details of cooperation, I think I do not see any problem of India working together with China on the Belt and Road Initiative. I think since the Chinese have first proposed this idea to India, when Dai Pinko came to India and spoke to the then special representative, Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon, but he spent less than 1 minute in a 45-minute discussion between the two on the BRI. So China's proposal to India should have been packaged 10-15 minutes instead of just last 1 minute of that 45 minutes discussion. So there is a possibility that India and China can work together on the BRI, provided these concerns are resolved, because the highest level leaderships have expressed concerns on these.
In one of your recent articles, you mentioned that a strong economic ties will ease the political tension between two countries. But if you look at the economic engagements, especially after Galwan, except trade, everything does not look very positive. There was a ban on Chinese applications, there is a restriction on foreign direct investment, telecom companies are not allowed to participate in Indian industry or companies, and the tenders, government tenders are not allowed to be given to Chinese and all. So with such a situation, how do we see the economic engagements increasing while the political tension is already there and nothing is moving on that side? How do you see it?
Well, there was the Joseph Nye and Robert Keohane. They wrote a book on economic interdependence, leading to blunting of the security aspects. So they analyzed various liberal institutional kind of approaches, and they found that if A and B are trading, if A and B are investing in each other, if A and B have people-to-people contacts or on other counts, then A feels less threatened by B's actions. Flowing from that, if you have more economic interactions, it is quite possible that they may not see each other as enemies or political tensions would not rise. So this is a theory which I was trying to apply. And I looked at, say, China-Japan, a very intensive conflict between the two. In fact, they fought with each other. And so when we look at this, they have China is the largest trading partner for Japan, $300 billion. Japan invested nearly $280 billion in China. Japan has some 83,000 multinational corporations of its own companies working in China. 83,000. Despite all the talk about India-Japan friendship, Japan has only 1,300 companies in India, while for an enemy like China, they have 83,000 companies. You can imagine the kind of economic interactions between the two. The Tokyo Olympics are being postponed because there is a restriction on tourists, and Japan earned $15.6 billion in revenues from tourism, mainly from 90% from China. So when we look at the economic interdependence between China and Japan, despite historical rivalries, despite issues on Senkaku Islands or on other issues, very, very tight economic cooperation between the two sides. So I was trying to apply this, and actually there is no conflict between India and China. For instance, we had a peace and tranquility agreement or on others. So overall, the territorial dispute is being managed between India and China. So actually, there is no conflict. Like the conflict between Japan and China, when you look at China and India conflict, it's not very intense. For example, forgetting about last 1 year events, for the past several decades, we don't have any mobilization on each other. So when we apply the economic interdependence, India and China could have done far better in terms of the trade, investments, and others. Of course, China is still the largest trading partner for India.
I think Nye and Cohen should add another assumption to their theory that the leadership of the country should be rational. US and China, they had a huge economic engagement. But look at what happened during Trump's era. Let me ask you about another important initiative in Asia, that is revival of Quad or the Quad Plus. What do you think? How viable, feasible or practical is Quad?
Well, I think at the moment they had 2+2 dialogue and a summit level meeting, virtual meeting between the four countries. And basic minimum program at this moment is on 3 issues. One is on vaccines, 1 billion vaccines to be developed this year. So American technology R&D, Japanese financing, Australian distribution, and Indian production. So on vaccines, that was the basic minimum agreement. Second is on critical technologies, research on quantum computing or on telecommunications. So that is an area that they are looking at. Thirdly is in the maritime domain. So the basic minimum aspects of the Quad is on these 3 issues. Again, they also mentioned about ASEAN centrality, and they also mentioned about the other issues where they have not identified specifically China in terms of the Quad declaration, the spirit of Quad that they mentioned. However, of course, China has a concern because initially Foreign Minister Wang Yi said that this is a sea foam, that it will disintegrate because number one, China is the largest trading partner for all these countries. Number two, China also believes that there are a lot of differences between all the four. US and India have a lot of differences. India and Australia have a lot of differences, and that came up during COVID-19 second wave when the Australians banned anybody, including their citizens, to go from India to Australia. So there are differences between all these Quad countries. So the Chinese assume that this will not go forward. However, we have seen on these 3 basic issues some agreement. I do not think this is going to be an alliance, a military alliance directed against China. I think there will be a lot of give and take between China and the Quad members. I do not think this will become a contentious issue, but there will be a give and take between China and all these 4 countries in the near future.
As it looks today, Quad is more like a loosely structured group of countries working together towards development in areas such as vaccine and technology sharing, etc. But is it the core of agenda of Quad countries, or there is something more to it, such as military alliance or security issues?
When the Quad was formed in 2007, 2004 first, and then actually in 2007 when they had this Malabar exercise, the 4-nation exercise, the focus was on the maritime domain. So when the Indo-Pacific was formed in 2017 and the idea for Quad was revived, the focus still has the maritime dimension. And in between 2007 to 17, what has happened is the 2016 Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling on the South China Sea. Now, Indo-Pacific has 4 areas. 1, West Pacific. 2nd, South China Sea. 3rd, Bay of Bengal. And 4th, the Indian Ocean. So in these 4 areas, Bay of Bengal has now become infamous for pirates and also Indian Ocean. While South China Sea problem came up in terms of the rule of law because of the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling and China walking away from the Hague Tribunal ruling. So idea is, if India can give up the 2 islands to Bangladesh when the Permanent Court of Arbitration gave in favor of Bangladesh, so why not other countries follow the rule of law? So the idea came up that their focus will be in the maritime, but rule of law, transparency, or other issues that the Quad Summit meeting mentioned in its joint statement. So it is true that there is the China angle, the maritime angle, but what these countries are trying to say is rule of law, and they are tracing this to 2016 Permanent Court of Arbitration rule. I do not think these Quad countries are going to displace China from these 9 reefs that has been militarized. I do not think that is the game plan. But the game plan, I think, is freedom of navigation, because China's concept is territorial sea, meaning this area is mine, and if you want to pass through, you need my blessings for your ship. So we had the INS Airawat incident in 2009. So other countries also had similar issues. So I think the freedom of navigation issue is one which is binding these Quad countries in the maritime domain. I do not think this is to displace China from those 9 reefs, because actually Vietnam controls the largest number of reefs in South China Sea.
Since India is a core member of Quad, and once Quad becomes more concrete and active, do you think it will impact India on other regional groupings where India and China are working together, such as SCO, BRICS, and BCIM?
There was an article by the Global Times saying India should be thrown out of the SCO and the BRICS. It's an interesting article, but I don't think this is as simple as that. When we look at the SCO, for example, SCO is run by the budgetary considerations. So China has 24% contribution, Russia has 24% contribution, and the rest of the countries 10%, the Central Asian and other countries. So when India applied for membership first in 2004, it took 13 years for India to join the SCO. That is partly because Russia was supporting India, while China was saying if India joins, Pakistan should also join the SCO. So finally, the Chinese position, it took for them 13 years to convince Russia on this aspect. So, of course, the other Central Asian republics as well, because this is through consensus. The SCO is through consensus decision making. So it is not possible to throw away any member in the SCO because consensus will be evaded in any future negotiations, as the membership itself was evaded for 13 years. So that is one key problem. In BRICS, at Fortaleza summit meeting of the BRICS, they decided one country, one vote in the BRICS. So China's position or China's strength is only 1/5 of all the members put together. So there is no way that China can throw away India from the BRICS, because India has equal membership, because that is what is decided in Fortaleza meeting. So as a result of this, I do not think that there will be any. So I think Global Times article is a highly nationalistic, extreme position. Out of frustration, they may have said this, but it is not practically possible unless until India itself withdraws from these initiatives, which I don't think so, because last year in Moscow, we saw the online meeting on SCO and the BRICS. In fact, the defense ministers met, the foreign ministers met, and also tried to resolve the Galwan related issue. So it did contribute even to the bilateral problems. So the SCO meeting, the BRICS meeting, I do not think will have any major impact of the Galwan incident. In fact, by September this year, I would expect President Xi Jinping to come to India to attend the BRICS summit meeting. And most important, will have a strategic dialogue with India, with the Indian Prime Minister. So my hunch is that there is a back channel diplomacy going on. Number one, India and China cannot go to war. It's a basic premise. We need to, because if they go to war, it's complete destruction on both sides. So it will not be open conflict between the two. Given that premise, there is no other go for China and India except to come back to the negotiating table. We will have possibly a third summit meeting in a different format, but we will have a strategic dialogue between the two leaders. My hope and my bet with you is they will resolve all these problems.
I hope so too. In 2019, when Mr. Modi came back to power, you had written an article where you had asked that India should do a cost-benefit analysis which for China's relationship on economic, strategic and political issues. Did it happen?
Well, I think when we look at the ground level situation, the total Chinese investments in India is $8.2 billion. When we look at, say, Japan or even Singapore, Singapore's investments are double that of China. Singapore is not the second largest economy in the world, yet it had invested double the Chinese investments. And Japan is third largest economy. It has $120 billion outlay for the high-speed railway and other projects, DMIC and others. US had $100 billion investment in India, which is nearly 10 times the Chinese investment in India. So what I was trying to say was that when we make a zero-based assessment, we need to keep all these factors. And whether that has happened, I do not know. But I think it was not accepted because we had the Wuhan meeting, we had the Chennai meeting, we had other meetings. It appears my proposal was not accepted by the government.
In all your writings and discourse on India-China relationship, you have been advocating that there has to be much more engagement between India and China, such as more studies, research, economic engagements, more communication and exchanges and all. But it seems this is not really happening.
I agree. When you have just about 3 lakh people moving from China to India or vice versa, this is not really much for 1.4 billion people and 1.2 billion people. There is 1 lakh Chinese coming, nearly 2 to 3 lakh Indian tourists going to China. So this is not a big number. To Maldives, which has a population of 4,20,000 people, there are 3,20,000 Chinese going every year to Maldives. That is the kind of figure. So India has huge tourist potential, tourist places. There may be some problem with tourism infrastructure and so on. Nevertheless, this is an area I think we need to crack on immediately. Second, of course, is in terms of manufacturing sector and service sector. There was a proposal during the Ahmedabad visit by President Xi Jinping on the 2 major manufacturing zones to be established in Ahmedabad and Pune. And there was a proposal for $20 billion for the next 5 years since 2014. But only $1.2 billion has been invested of that amount. Somebody can say there is a land acquisition problem, there is a labor unrest, there is this issue or that issue. This is not happening with the other companies. Other companies are also coming and establishing. For instance, the Foxconn, it also had a problem in terms of the labor strike or other disruptions. So I think there needs to be something moving on the ground. So I was trying to say in these that, number one, we have an issue at the national interest. So when these have negative consequences for India, I was trying to criticize China on that front. But when it comes to economic interdependence, other aspects, I'm all for it. And I was trying to say we need to do ABCD in these regards. Look at China-Japan relations. They do have problems, but they try to resolve because the larger picture came up for the leaderships. So that was what I was trying to argue all through.
Also, recently you wrote that stakes are high in the medium and long term for India-China relationship? What do you think of immediate and short term?
In general, when we say short term, it's about from now to about 5 years, medium term 5 to 10 years, 12 years, long term from 15 years to about 20, 30 years. So in this span, I was trying to say that in the short term, we need to protect the borders. So CBM's approach is crucial in this front. We should not have any skirmishes on this so that we keep the bilateral relations relatively stable and leave it to the militaries to sort that out in terms of the CBMs. So that was what the short term. And in the meanwhile, we need to also engage at various levels, especially in investments, infrastructure, or on other counts, or in multilateral institutions. That is where we need to build an architecture. That is what I was trying to say. We do have a conflict of interest with China because, as I mentioned, if China wants to occupy the center stage, then as Nehru suggested, we have to play a second fiddle with China. For India, any leader who becomes the prime minister, this is the most crucial things to explain to the Indian people. As a representative of 1.27 billion, he or she needs to explain to the people, he or she is representing these many people. And the fifth or sixth largest economy, and we are not going to play a second fiddle to anyone.
For the present standoff between India and China, it seems that India is saying that they are not willing to engage with China on any other issues unless the Galwan issue has been sorted out, which means status quo ante. China, it seems, after partial withdrawal, thinks that things have been sorted out. So where do we go from here?
Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi went to Beijing in 1988. The joint statement referred to that the territorial dispute cannot be resolved right now because from 81 to 87, there were 8 rounds of discussions. And in these discussions, they could not find a solution for all practical purposes. So what they decided is let the territorial dispute does not become problem for the bilateral relations. So let peace and tranquility prevail on the border areas. Now we have a new situation since March last year, which is there are reports in Bloomberg or in the Hindu or other newspapers that China is currently in occupation of 1,000 square kilometers or 300 square kilometers. We do not know whether it is true or not. But what is important is that basically this is a disputed territory, as they have been saying. Since China began saying that this is a sovereign territory of China, so they moved from disputed to that of sovereignty, which means a new element has been added to this, which again then implication means that we now have the territorial dispute becoming the center stage of the bilateral relations. And it is having a spillover effect on other aspects. So because the Rajiv Gandhi visit and subsequently the arrangement has been not observed since March 2020, we again go back to pre-1988 position, which is again putting the territorial dispute in the center stage. So there is actually then a problem for the bilateral relations. If China does not address the territorial dispute or the fallout of this, then we are not going to have the bilateral relations developing, including economic field. So this is what this government had taken, that position. Dr. Jaishankar has explained these issues about the deal in 1988 and subsequently, and their violation since March 2020. So I think this also can be resolved because the larger issue I was trying to argue is India and China cannot go to war in order to pick up territory, in order to expand or whatever. There is no way they can go to war unless until they are willing to totally destroy each other. So the argument I was trying to say is that they will find, if not yesterday, if not today, tomorrow they will find time for this strategic dialogue between the two leaders, and a third informal summit meeting is inevitable.
If you have been asked by Indian and Chinese leadership to give one suggestion for betterment of India-China relationship, what it will be?
For both the leaders, I would suggest they should meet immediately and have the third informal summit meeting. Intensive institutionalized engagement process is necessary for both.
Since Wuhan and Mahamalipuram did not yield any result, do you think that third meeting will be successful?
I'm not sure, but I was trying to see what are the alternatives, and I don't find any other alternative except for both the leaders coming to the table or increase costs for each of them. So that is not possible because no leader wants to increase costs. So they have to come, discuss, and resolve many of these issues. And there is a world out there to discover.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kondapalli. It was indeed a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.